This transition to renewables, wind and solar predominantly, battery backup, this forced march to it. One of the biggest cost drivers, transmission lines. And the fact is they're expensive, somewhere between the last estimate that I heard between $1 and $4 million a mile. And we need hundreds of thousands of miles of transmission lines to get this done.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in Colorado. I'm one of your co-hosts, Jake Fogleman, joined by my other co-host, Amy Cooke, this time remote because she's back in North Carolina. She's joining us here remotely to talk about some exciting stuff, specifically FERC Order 1920. And if everyone's eyes glazed over or rolled over hearing that, don't worry, we're not going to get into the technical, legal, regulatory minutia of this. We want to talk a little bit more about sort of the politics of this and the policy of this, some of the second order effects. So Amy, why don't you kick us off about what this rule is, what's it about, and what kind of fights is it going to start?
You know, you are a true policy analyst when you talk about the exciting developments of a FERC rule that is over 1,300 pages long. The thing is a beast. And I'll be honest, I have not read all of it. 1,300 pages? No, I mean, so I'm like the rest of everybody else. I want to just, my eyes glaze over. That being said, the impacts of it based on people that we trust, one of those being Travis Fisher, who's a favorite of ours on here. We've referenced him a couple of times. He is Cato's Director of Energy and Environmental Policy. He's written about it. He used to be, I think it was an advisor to FERC. So he knows the space. But this FERC rule 1920, and we're actually going to talk about what the impact will be on what it is sort of nationally, but more importantly, because we're a Colorado focused show, we're going to talk about the impact on Colorado. The Wall Street Journal had a great article called the Big Green Transmission Coup. So you can take from that op-ed exactly what this might be doing, and we'll drop that in the show notes. But I look at this rule, and to me, it does three things. The first one is it socializes the cost of transmission lines. Jake, you and I have touched on this a couple of times. One of the biggest cost drivers of this this transition to I call it a forced march. We've called it a forced transition, but this transition to renewables, wind and solar predominantly, battery backup, this forced march to it. One of the biggest cost drivers, transmission lines. And the fact is they're expensive, somewhere between the last estimate that I heard between $1 and $4 million a mile. And we need hundreds of thousands of miles of transmission lines to get this done. And we actually spoke to a transmission expert about this. He's like, you're not going to do it because there isn't enough money. Number one, and number two, there isn't enough. You just can't even get the parts. Talk about a supply chain issue. But
yeah, I don't want to, sorry to cut you off, but I want to highlight something on that. Is actually transmission itself is the fastest growing segment where it's the fastest driver of electricity price increases right now. It's not even the generation side anymore. It's because of things like the supply chain issues. So getting electricity to where it needs to go is already getting more expensive than it's ever been. And as you said, to comport with this transition, we're going to need a whole heck of a lot more of it. So sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to leave that with the listeners.
No. That's good. It socializes the cost. So in other words, what'll happen is states like Colorado, blue states like Colorado, the cost of these transmission lines across the country will be socialized. So think about Nebraska subsidizing Colorado or Wyoming or Utah subsidizing transmission costs in Colorado because it is socializing the costs across the country. It says it's going to reduce reliability. I would challenge that. I think we would challenge that. It is going to enable more wind and solar on the grid, which, as we have talked about ad nauseum, is going to reduce reliability overall. I think one of the biggest things too is the Department of Energy has tried to make it easier because of this, as part of this, make it easier to get a, I guess, NEPA permit, National Environmental Policy Act, which essentially established the EPA. It will make, they're trying to make it easier to get around NEPA, and they call it a simple permit. I think what this does is sets up a challenge for NEPA. We know that the left has used NEPA a lot all the time to challenge with permitting for drill sites or coal plants or anything else. So the left has used NEPA. Actually, it's been their go-to weapon for climate lawfare. So now you'll see, my guess is you're going to see other attorneys starting to use this, other groups starting to use it to challenge some of these transmission lines. So the bottom line is, I think it's actually, we estimated in one of our studies, Jake, that it would cost almost $11 billion for transmission lines just in Colorado. So do the math. If we have, I think it's 3 million households in Colorado, it's like $3,700 per household. And that's just for the transmission lines. This total cost of this whole transition is far higher than that. This is just the transmission lines. So if Colorado gets to, if we're socializing the costs on Colorado across all these other states, that's a benefit to Colorado. And do you mind if I just read real quick what Mark Christie, who is a FERC commissioner who voted against order number 1920. It was by a 3-2 vote on FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, just so that you all know what FERC stands for. But Mark Christie voted against it, and he said this, Commissioner Christie said this, he said, this rule could not come at a worse time for consumers. It is indisputable that power bills are rising faster than overall inflation, which itself is very high. And it's indisputable, and this gets to your point too, Jake, that you just made, that transmission rates are now the fastest rising part of those power bills. And it's a historic failure to stay within our legal authority. And worst of all, it's a historic failure to meet our basic obligations under the Federal Power Act to protect consumers. And we can get into that too, because it's also a federalism issue.
It absolutely is. I think what you pointed out, what you're going to see, at least what you anticipate, what I anticipate, is sort of this red state versus blue state divide. We talked about it a little bit last episode because of policies like this, where you now have states that maybe have not pursued these policies at the state level, but nevertheless, because of rules like this, will be on the hook for paying at least a portion of the transmission costs of states like Colorado, who have put the pedal to the metal when it comes to these sort of clean energy build-outs. One of the things that I think also... I've been...
You're getting over a cold, so you've got some grace.
Yeah, listeners, bear with me here. Sorry about that. But another way that this benefits Colorado, a few episodes back, listeners may recall we covered a Colorado Energy Office study where they attempted to at least put together a cost analysis of their plan to get to 100% renewables by 2040. And one of the things we dinged them on was the fact that they did not include anything on transmission lines and those costs. Well, now here comes FERC to help save the day because now they don't have to put that staggering 11 billion, which we predicted in 2017, something along those lines. They no longer have to put that full amount on top of their plans because the federal government gets to come in and help bail them out. So thank you to our neighbors who are going to be paying with their electricity bills for Colorado's policy plans.
I want to just touch on a couple of things, if it's okay, on what this was what the Wall Street Journal said about this FERC Order 1920. It said, now Democrats can bypass Congress on permitting reform. So in other words, permitting reform, which should be coming from Congress, FERC is doing the dirty work that that Democrats in Congress didn't want to do. They didn't want to have to compromise with Republicans on it. So FERC has done that dirty work for them. And in fact, here is what Chuck Schumer, who is majority leader of the Senate, said. He said, what we need to see, the clean energy revolution we catalyzed with the Inflation Reduction Act come to fruition. And that's how we characterize FERC's actions. That FERC was sort of actually, as Chuck Schumer put it, FERC was in their back pocket. They always had FERC in their back pocket because the commissioners were, the two commissioners that voted yes, were Biden appointees. And so they voted yes, and they were willing to do what they couldn't get through Congress. And I love this. Under this rule, all states will be considered beneficiaries from new transmission lines that increase renewable generation because supposedly it will reduce the likelihood, I love this, of blackouts and electric prices. Which never mind, forget the fact that wind and solar are unreliable and the fact that wind and solar are more expensive than existing baseload power. So, and they say, in other words, this means Pennsylvanians will subsidize New Jersey's anti-fossil fuel policies. And I said, well, states like Wyoming will subsidize Colorado. And it gives states like Colorado really more of an incentive to pursue these just really fantastic, these fantasy goals. There will be FERC allows them to deny reality.
Yeah. I love the point you made about, once again, an agency doing the dirty work that couldn't get done in Congress because, we haven't really seen that before, right, in energy policy in the past. There hasn't been any major Supreme Court cases that have said you can't do that anymore. West Virginia versus EPA and the Clean Power Plan. That's another, I think, aspect of potential future litigation that I think you'll see from this, because I think a lot of folks on the Republican side, or maybe not even the Republican side, folks like Joe Manchin and similarly minded lawmakers might say, this seems like a pretty major question to me, something with substantial economic impact. You're talking about $11 billion of transmission lines in one state alone, let alone all 50 states. That seems like something that ought to come from Congress. So I think we'll probably see some court challenges over this. But yeah, your point is totally correct about how this is both an implicit and an explicit subsidy for states like Colorado, not only to fund transmission lines, but it also is an implicit subsidy for their policy prerogatives, because now they can say, well, we can keep going pedal to the metal with distributed wind and solar. We don't have to worry about, more land efficient, replacing coal power plants with existing transmission lines. We don't have to worry about that because the federal government and our neighboring states will help us fund that. So,
and remember too, the Federal Power Act of 1935 gave states the authority over transmission lines. So there is a federalism aspect to this.
Yep.
So subsidizing cost and forcing states to subsidize other states that make different policy decisions are crazy. The other thing is too, I love what you said about it we get to deny reality. And one of the realities is just, besides the supply chain issue, which we talked about, the other reality is just the inefficient use of land. And so Wyoming will have to subsidize Colorado, or Utah will subsidize Colorado, and their inefficient use of land. One of the things we estimated in a 2017, late 2017 study that we did back, this was when the first, they were campaigning on the 100% renewable stuff. One of the things that we said, just wind and solar alone, and I don't know if this included transmission lines. I'll have to go back and check, but wind and solar by themselves and battery storage, we're going to need something like 500,000 additional acres of land. Now, 500,000 Rocky Mountain National Park is only 268,000 acres. The Pawnee National Grasslands are 190,000 acres. I mean, that to take that kind of land out of commission and use it solely for, sort of renewables and battery storage, and I shouldn't say solely, because at least wind, you can do other things with it. But the point being, to take that amount of land sort of out of circulation, and what, or more so with solar, right, where you just can't even use it for anything other than solar. It sort of outsources to rural areas the generation side, so that dense populations don't have to see it.
Yeah.
Right. They just see the power lines or the power come in. It is out of sight for them.
Yeah, and you already saw some of the backlash to that when Xcel, for example, proposed their I think they called the Power Pathways transmission project, and that was something like 500 miles of transmission lines, and that caused a big ruckus. So imagine what this is going to look like when the federal government turbocharges that transmission build out, and to build all of those land extensive renewables. We're coming up on time here, Amy. I know we're pressed for time this week, but
Yep.
As always, we want to leave the listeners with your 3 takeaways. I think listeners really enjoy that. So what should listeners remember about FERC Order 1920, other than that it's an eye-glazing monstrosity at 1,300 pages?
Right. So I actually have more than 3, and I tried to narrow it down, but I couldn't. One, it socializes the cost, and that's a benefit to Colorado. Listen, Colorado is going to, if this goes through, Colorado will enjoy the benefits of other states subsidizing our transmission lines. That's one. It is a challenge to federalism, for sure, because essentially it is FERC coming in, telling states that they're all going to have to pay for these new transmission lines without the authority of Congress or anything like that. It steps on the 1935 Federal Power Act. It's going to reduce reliability of the grid, so it's going to hurt the grid. This is a big one, and this has to do with NEPA. And will we see the right side of the aisle starting to embrace NEPA, which we've all been screaming for reform? But here, because we don't want to socialize costs across state lines, will we see the right starting to use NEPA to challenge some of these transmission permits? I think that's going to be a big one. What happens with NEPA? Keep your eye on NEPA. And last, as always, I can't say, get a generator, because costs are going to go up and reliability is going down.
You heard it here, folks. As always, buy a generator. But that does it for us for another episode of PowerGab. If you like what you heard here, head on over to powergab.org to check out our entire back catalog. We have new episodes every week, available on YouTube, on our IITV channel, as well as in audio formats, wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify to iTunes. And if you want to suggest topics or you want to ask questions, you just send those over to info@powergab.org. We always love to hear from our listeners. But until next week, we'll see you.